Sorry, I had to set time because otherwise I can talk about Yemen forever. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. I think the lunch was wonderful. I don't know if you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. We're here to talk about an issue that is very complicated. I've been talking about it since the start of the war. And oddly, in 4 years, I have to say, I haven't heard myself repeat myself so many times on the same points over and over again. And that is, we knew that if a war happened in Yemen, that the humanitarian situation that was looking like it was serious before the war started is just going to get exacerbated. And that's exactly what happened. And at the start of the war, we warned about famine, we warned about displacement, we warned about civilian casualties, we warned about further complications. And by further complications, I'm speaking about political complications specifically. And that is exactly what happened. I mean, today, I am standing here, and I think for people who are mediators who are trying to fix the problem in Yemen, they're facing a far more complicated situation than they did 3 years ago. And by that, I mean that in the last 2 weeks or so, there's an uptick in Houthi or Ansarullah's recruitment and military efforts on the ground. And I think that this kind of speedy movement, we haven't seen anything like it since the start of the war. And it's alarming for someone like me. And it only started when former President Ali Abdullah Saleh was assassinated. I think with him out of the picture, the war in Yemen now is really the Saudi-led coalition allied with the Yemeni government versus the Houthis on the ground. Other than that, we have to talk about the fact that in Yemen there are a lot more factions that are fighting within on the ground. We just haven't given them big names. We just call them allies of the government or allies of the Houthi. But in general, there are a lot of movements that are fighting within. And in the US specifically, and I'm speaking here to our audiences, we've tried several times to do events at Congress. We've participated enough, kind of tried to support attempts to slow down or even stop the arms sales to Saudi Arabia, or even have the Sanders-Lee bill, which was going to say that the US shouldn't participate directly in this war. They all did not pass, but we were close to getting them passed. And I think that speaks a lot to where the US is today on Yemen. I think that everybody involved in the Yemeni situation realizes that this situation is not going to end well, that there will be casualties, there will be deaths, there will be diseases. And so it's in everyone's interest to come to the table and kind of negotiate some sort of settlement. Now, the rhetoric on the ground is that Martin Griffiths, who's the new UN envoy to Yemen, we heard a lot of people say that they're very optimistic and excited about having him there. He's listening to everyone. The Houthis on the ground were able to meet him, and he met with Abdel Malik al-Houthi, which is kind of a big deal since nobody else has the same access to him. And so everybody's putting so much weight on this new UN envoy. But what I'm seeing now is that this process is too slow, because while he's sitting around taking this information in, we see an increase of military operations from the Saudi side and from the Houthi side. And I can say very, very confidently today that 4 years ago, Iran's presence in Yemen was far less than it is today. And that is a scary thing about this war, is that the longer you allow the war to continue, what is happening on the ground in Yemen is that there are no resources, there's no government to take control, and you are turning Yemenis into war tools. The population is then easily mobilized to any fighting side, whether it's the Houthis or the Saudi-led coalition or the UAE. And on top of that, I tend to worry a lot about what's happening in the south of Yemen, where this is a ground where you can rebuild and restructure what kind of destruction took place in the war. And what you see there is that the government has not been able to return to the south, and when it does return, they're under threat. They have military bases, and those military bases do not get along with each other because each military base has allegiance to a separate leader. The presence of the UAE there is extremely heavy. And just today, actually, a new Southern Transitional Coalition was created on top of the Southern Separatist Movement. So in the South, we have a popular separatist movement that's been calling for secession since 2007. And we see that this coalition continued to operate peacefully until 2011, and then they were armed in this war, and the armed faction of the Southern separatist movement demanded secession by force, but they're constantly calmed down through the coalition's efforts. And just today, a new Southern Transitional Council or Coalition was created, and what's interesting about this coalition is they are from all political parties in Yemen, so there's 65 members from all political parties, but they are for secession and in support of President Hadi, even though President Hadi says that he's not in support of secession. So I think this particular group today that I'm talking about is the easiest group to kind of look at because it's simple. It's created today, it's 65 members, and they have one leg on one side and one leg on the other side, and that's how Yemenis are. This is how Yemeni politics is. And I think when it comes to the Houthis specifically, at the start of the war, it would have been in everyone's interest to kind of bring them to the table and absorb their efforts and include them in a government as opposed to allow them to reign. Because today they are far more frightening than they were before, but definitely the scary part of this is in any attempt that the Saudi coalition would take to combat them, a large number of civilians is at threat. So if, for example, the Houthi coalition decides to launch a missile to Saudi Arabia and it gets intercepted, that same day the response would be sending a lot of missiles into Sana'a that would terrorize and scare Yemeni civilians. And there is no guarantee that the targets that they're aiming at are not including women and children who have nothing to do with this conflict. Now, I think that previously, before starting to talk about this, they mentioned the humanitarian situation, and I can sit here and drill the numbers again and again, but I think we all understand that it's really hard to have access to medication there. The Yemeni rial is crashing hard. About $1 now would be around 480 to 500 Yemeni rials, and it's continuing to, this inflation in Yemen is just, there's no stopping it. And the problem is we also have a lot of goods that go through the black market. And Yemen is struggling with basic diseases. And that's kind of the saddest thing is you have a war, you have a humanitarian catastrophe, you have political unrest. And even if there is peace in Yemen today, even if every party stops fighting, these problems are going to continue to make Yemen suffer. They're going to continue to cause instability. They will continue to make things difficult. So the sooner we are to stop it, the better it is. And I'm standing here and I feel like I've said this so many times. What we're seeing today also is an escalation to the war, specifically from the side of Hodeidah. Hodeidah is a port city, to those who don't know much about it. A lot of the humanitarian aid to the majority of the north goes through there. It is now pretty much a port where only aid goes through, and there were American cranes that were delivered there to help unload shipments of aid. The problem with Hodeidah is it's a coast city, and there are always talks about kind of going in and fighting the Houthis on the ground militarily through Hodeidah. And I highly warn against this just because of the human life that it might face. The people of Tahama, specifically in Hodeidah, have suffered at the hands of the Yemeni government, at the hands of the Imama, and continue to suffer today in the sense that they don't have access to water, their health situation is really bad, and they continue to be one of the least armed groups in Yemen. And so with that kind of war taking place on their territory, one should bear in mind who lives in that area, what are the consequences on the civilians around it, and so on and so forth. I think the best way to move forward is to put pressure here in the US on policymakers and on the UN specifically to kind of make a very prominent, like very imminent push towards the table. And by that I mean that the United Nations Security Council has not really issued anything serious in regards to Yemen in the past 2 years. They've been kind of silent. We need to hear a little bit more from them. We need to see them push strong language that is anti-war in Yemen that protects civilians. I think in terms of everything, I think ultimately the main focus is if the war is going to continue, what can we do to make it less severe? Well, obviously, slow down the targeting that is inaccurate. Don't use weapons unless necessary. I mean, I can't even believe that I'm saying this because ultimately the best solution is to stop the war altogether. But I think on another level, something that everybody needs to focus on is a shift away from aid money and more into development in Yemen. Everybody on the ground in Yemen who's been there for 4 years, a lot of people I know have not received their salaries for probably the 3rd, 4th year now in a row. And so even if they have basic goods and commodities at the stores, people cannot afford them because they have no salaries, they have no livelihood. And about 70% of the Yemeni population depends on salaries from the government. So that's a high number. And on top of it, almost all the goods that come to Yemen are imported. And so I think looking at a way to save Yemen would be also looking at ways to create development programs there on the ground to shift the focus from immediate aid into investing in the population, into investing in women, into entrepreneurship, and to kind of trying to restart life again. I think I'm gonna stop it here, allow the other speakers to talk, but I'm happy to take Q&As later, and I'm happy to do more specific questions so that everybody gets their questions answered. So thank you for this opportunity.